Welcome back. Time for culture. Now, it's the 50th anniversary of the 1962 peace agreement between France and Algeria that ended 132 years of colonial rule. It also ended the 8-year War of Independence driven by the National Liberation Front political party. Now, in a minute, we'll be hearing from our book critic Augustin Trapenard, who'll be telling us about some novels reflecting on Algeria's history. Hello, Augustin. We'll come to you in just a moment. First, though, we've been to meet two French Algerian comic book artists whose work looks at the young country's past.
It's one of the darker chapters in France's modern history. But now two Frenchmen of Algerian extraction have banded together to create a comic telling a little-known tale of France's occupation of Algeria.
I thought it would be interesting to talk about the colonial period, but not about the war side of things, more as a way of teaching people.
Colonial Lessons takes place in the northeastern Algerian town Sétif, a town which, in spite of efforts by a French school teacher, becomes first the scene of an uprising and then of a massacre of pro-independence protesters on May the 8th, 1945. Writer Amobe Mevegue says the events left an indelible mark on the Algerian people, but are frequently omitted from history textbooks.
Our parents bear the burden of the awful silence over this massacre. We have to preserve the memory of these events because we cannot cover up scars like these.
In spite of the scars, the comic's creators say they're not seeking revenge, but merely to sketch their portrait of Algeria's past.
Turning to you now, Augustin. So 50 years ago today, Algeria gained independence from France, and you're using this occasion to tell us about two books that are about breaking the Algerian taboo in French culture.
That's right, Claire, because we don't talk about the War of Independence, here in France. It's a huge taboo, probably because it is definitely one of the darkest pages of our recent history. The wounds have not been healed, definitely. And this is quite clear when you take a look at the Algerian War novels. There are very few, because representing the war is still a huge taboo. So I brought two novels today that break this taboo, both about the Algerian War, but extremely different. They were not published at the same time. The authors come from a different generation. One is a man, the other is a woman. One is French, the other is Algerian. And let's start with the Algerian one, precisely. It's called Children of the New World. It's a novel by Assia Djebar, and she published this book in 1962.
And it must be pretty interesting getting a woman's perspective on this.
It is, definitely, and even more so. Assia Djebar was 26 when she published this book, when she wrote this novel, which is, of course, politically committed, anti-colonialist, but also feminist. It's a novel where she speaks out, the struggles, the cries of a bunch of anonymous people living in a small village in the spring of 1956. And each character in this book has his own chapter. They're all linked, basically to a woman who's just been killed by a bomb. And through this day, through their interactions also, you can see the violence of the war, the inner war also between men and women, and also the trauma of torture. This book was published in 1962, Claire, and it's one of the first that mentioned clearly the trauma of torture.
Why do you think it's called Children of the New World?
Well, the book was definitely published the year of the independence in 1962, and even though the plot takes place in 1956, you can feel, the promise and the possibility of a new world. And it's in a character's fight for freedom. It's in the pride or the sense of honor of a woman. It's also in the noble gesture of giving first aid to wounded soldiers, for instance. It's a major novel, in my opinion. And you know that the author, Assia Djebar, has been shortlisted for quite a long time now for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I think this year might be the one, so watch out in October.
Right, you heard it here first. Okay, moving on now to the second book that you've brought in. It's called Where I Left My Soul, and it's by Jérôme Ferrari.
That's right. So first I have to say it's a French book that was published 2 years ago, and that will be available in English in September, which is quite rare, for a French novel to be translated. So basically the author, Jérôme Ferrari, is 40-something, which is quite interesting because it means that he comes from a generation that has not experienced directly the war. He's part of this generation who tries to break a taboo and to put a name on a war that has been called for a very long time, the war with no name. It was called the Algerian War only in 1999. So basically the plot of this book, Where I Left My Soul, takes place in 1957. Two French soldiers that used to be heroes in the Second World War, but also in French Vietnam. And basically they meet again in Algiers and they do what they have to do. It's very interesting because they were heroes, but now they are torturers. And one of them, takes it very well in a way. He's okay with it. The other cannot possibly deal with the guilt. And the only person he can talk to is a prisoner, is the enemy. It's actually a commander in the National Liberation Army.
I have to say, Augustin, that you're talking about this book with a lot of enthusiasm.
I am, definitely. And I think, Claire, that Jérôme Ferrari is one of the most important French authors at the moment. What he does with the language is absolutely beautiful. The language is lyrical. It's extremely powerful, beautiful too. And also, I find quite fascinating the way, he tackles this dark page of French history and the way he shows that it is part of our heritage, whether we want it or not. And guess what? 2 years ago, he was here at France 24. He was the guest of the beautiful Louise Dupont, and he talked about that. We have a few images. Just take a listen.
Je sais tout simplement que j'aurais jamais écrit ce roman si j'avais pas vécu.
I know I wouldn't have written this novel if I hadn't lived in Algeria. It's not even a question of legitimacy, but of proximity, familiarity. In my book, I talk about something that was unknown to me, the war, a period that I didn't live through, and in order to get close enough, I had to sense that there was something in the story familiar to me.
And that's the thing with literature, isn't it? That it really helps us remember these important times, that they're not forgotten.
Exactly. And that's why I brought 2 novels instead of essays on the Algerian War. There are plenty of essays on this subject. But the novel is different because the reader can penetrate, the mind, the body, the language also of a character. And he can experience literally what really happened and what to do, most of all, so that it doesn't happen again.
Okay, so just a quick reminder then, we've got Children of the New World by Assia Djebar. Did I pronounce that right?
Wonderful.
Correctly, great. And Where I Left My Soul by Jérôme Ferrari.
That's right.
Great, thank you very much, Augustin Trapenard, for that. Thank you for watching France 24. That's it for Culture. That's it from all of us here on Live from Paris. Thanks very much for watching and do stay tuned.